And even though I do want to incorporate this YouTube clip, I noticed that the sound on it's very low. It's hard to hear it. And I think they do that on purpose so that you'll subscribe to their channel and get the better video and audio quality. And I'm not quite prepared to invest in that because I'm not really that interested in ancient aliens, but I think it'll help us bring out an aspect from that clip because it deals specifically with Ramses II and pharaohs of that period. And we don't know exactly which pharaoh was pharaoh at the time of the Exodus. There were several Ramses, and possibly it was this Ramses II that did all the building. But I think something the scholars are dropping and they're arguing about which pharaoh it was. Well, number one, most of them don't even believe there was an Exodus, so that colors the argument a little. To them, they're trying to knit a fable into what they consider hard science or history. And for us, I think it's the reverse. If there is science, archaeology out there, then by definition, that knowledge is incomplete because we don't live in that time period. And the Egyptians were notorious for not recording anything of negative, anything that would reflect on them negatively. It's the opposite of our news structure. If anything horrible happens in the United States, it's out there immediately. It's going to be recorded and passed on and retweeted or whatever, forwarded. That's the headline. But in Egypt, if you didn't do well, then you didn't write that on the wall. Or if another pharaoh arose who didn't like what a previous pharaoh had done, they would deface anything. Like if they had a statue, they would deface the statue. If there was writing, they would plaster over it, rewrite a new history, which is kind of what we do with the internet. But if you don't like it, just delete it, right? Rewrite it. But so by definition, they're speculating from their point of view. They have hard science. And from our point of view, we have the Bible, which is not intended to be a history chronicle. History is merely an incidental to how Adonai chooses to work in any given point in time. And so we're not using the Bible as a history book or a science book, even though it has history and science and politics and economics and law and story. It has all those things, but there's no one thing out of those things that is a primary purpose. It's so beautifully complex and simple. And I think it's a mistake to listen to historians or archaeologists, paleontologists, or whatever in terms of dating things when we know the Earth has been through pretty severe catastrophes, especially the flood, at least one of them. And so it's one of those things where I think it would be wise in terms of trying to figure out which exact pharaoh, just to put that one on the shelf. And eventually that one will iron itself out. We advanced, one of the students, Marie Olmsted, had sent me an article that had a link to another article that said there was a particular pharaoh in about the right time period, Tutmos II, maybe, I can't remember. She put the link on there and I think I called it out loud so anybody that wasn't looking could hear it. But this particular pharaoh had been mummified and his body was full of cysts. And the scholar speculated, is it possible if this were the one, did they fish his body out of the Red Sea and mummify it? And did he still have the scars from all the cysts from the plague of boils? But it was almost like tongue in cheek, like, sure, this really happened. And, but that would make sense because in the Haftorah that we read Monday night in Ezekiel, it does talk about, the prophecy is that I will put a hook in your cheeks and I will draw you out of the river and your fish will cling to your scales. And so if they did fish that particular pharaoh out of the sea and go ahead and mummify him, maybe that's the one. Maybe it was Tutmos. But let me go ahead and start this video so we can get right into the pestilence, which I know we're all interested in pestilence and locusts, but let me see if I can screen share here. And you'll have to let me know if the microphone's not picking it up where you can hear it at all. Can you see that? Does it say YouTube? Okay.
By looking into the extraordinary origins of the Egyptian pharaohs.
Oh, Lisa, I don't have any sound with this.
How about now? How strange. It didn't like Ancient Aliens. Okay, I typed it in the chat box so you can go watch it. It's about 5 minutes out of the the very beginning. I think it starts around the 4th minute and it goes for maybe 4 to 5 minutes. It's a very short clip about the pharaohs that are very close to our period. And I thought there was a couple of interesting observations there. Well, 3. I think there was 3 main points I wanted you to see is how much both the pharaohs and the people believed that they were gods, that they were divine, and that they had a place in the pantheon of their gods. And so every challenge that Pharaoh finds himself helpless to respond. I mean, at first they're using magic charms, and there's the history of that with their gods, of using magic charms. And that was in a little clip I showed you that you couldn't hear, was how Isis took the 14 pieces of her brother and performed the first magic charm resurrection, which if you have time to go back and listen to Monday nights, you'll see how the magic charms and the charm of the revolving sword played into this conflict going back and forth between the magicians and Moses, and why the snake / sea serpent were important in that context. But they were they were putting themselves along with the gods. In fact, I believe it was the Ramses, when the sun came up in the temple, it was designed to shine on him as opposed to all the other gods that were seated there alongside him. So that's how lifted up in his heart that he was. And that's why, say, the taunt that Moses gives to him, where he says, glorify yourself. Tell me what time to stop the frogs. In other words, how can you say you're God of Egypt if you can't make the frogs go away at a specific time? Sure, with your little magic charms, you can make frogs appear, but I can tell them exactly what time they have to go away. You can't do that with your magic charms. It's like an Elijah battle with the priests of Baal. Like, okay, let's just test and see. And Elijah kind of again taunts the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel. He says, well, maybe your God's in the bathroom. Maybe he's sitting on the toilet. And in this Torah portion, we get kind of the same taunt. And I told that to the Monday night class. When Pharaoh goes out early in the morning to the Nile, he's crouching. And it'll say that in the Haftorah, he's crouching in the Nile. What is he doing there? He's doing his morning constitutional. He's doing his bodily functions where nobody can see him because they think he's a god. And if he's a god, then of course he doesn't have to do those things. I said, I should compile a year's worth of daily, this is funnies. When you read the Hebrew text and you realize what it's actually saying, I mean, it's funny that Moses goes out each day at his most vulnerable moment when he's having to use the toilet in the Nile so no one can see him, and confronting him and saying, you're not a god. You're just like the rest of us. We all have to go out in the morning and take care of business. And so it's like a taunt on top of a taunt. And we know that there was a change in pharaohs through to there, and sometimes trying to figure out exactly which pharaoh. That's one reason it's a mess, because we know that the pharaoh died like halfway through the story, and then Moses has to start with a new pharaoh. And that's not the same pharaoh that didn't know Joseph. So it's getting worse. So just trying to figure out if Ramses was a big builder, it could have been a later pharaoh that was actually involved with them. Yes.
I just have a question. So then are you saying that that when he went to Pharaoh to, let my people go kind of thing, that was in that morning time during that time? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Whenever it says early in the morning, and the reason we know this is because the Haftorah tells us that he's crouching, which is that euphemism for, it's like sometimes they'll say covering your feet. Because when you squat down, if you're wearing what they wore, then you're covering your feet. And it's it's deeper than what we get in English. In English, we're like, well, that was nice. He was covering his feet, you know. Not exactly. So Pharaoh crouching in the Nile, I mean, he's supposed to be this big, tough alligator god or crocodile god. And what is he doing? He's doing what we all do. He's a human. He's nothing but a mortal. And that's what Moses keeps reminding him when, like, he says, glorify yourself, pick a time, you know, and I'll show you who the God of Israel is that you claim not to know. He's not in your house of gods. And so as time progresses, he has to admit he's nothing but a mortal, and it builds over time. Another thing I wanted to point out is they actually have the remnants of Cain and Abel's story. I know you couldn't hear it, but you saw the pictures of the two gods, and the one brother rises up against the other brother and kills him. And that goes back to what the rabbis say about the Tower of Babel. It wasn't so much that Adonai created brand new languages and put them in people's mouths. It's that he took the pure language and he confused it, and they put them in their mouths. And so probably at that time, I would say human history, they also had that, but it was confused like their speech. And you know how hard it is to convey something to someone, like when your friend from First Baptist down the street says, who's this Yeshua you keep talking about? Or what is this Torah you keep talking about? Well, the beauty of Yeshua or Torah is really found in the Hebrew. We have English names like salvation or the first 5 books of the Bible, but when you get into like Torah, God's teaching and instruction and everything wonderful it says about it in Psalm 119, it's hard to convey that in English. So imagine when their languages were confused, how the history was confused. Plus, and this is the third item I wanted to bring in there, and the rest you can kind of surmise if you go back and watch the clip. And that was on YouTube, by the way. That's where I got the clip. I don't know how much it would cost to buy the actual program, but I didn't want the whole program because I don't believe in extraterrestrials the way they're portraying them in this. They're completely disregarding the demonic activity that the Torah portion is talking about. And that was the other component, is that it's not in the Gospels where we start seeing a strong influence of demons upon people and possession of people by demons. It's in this portion where you get a lot of it. If you're paying attention to what's happening, like that they're using necromancers, like people that talk to the dead, that they're using the charm of the revolving sword, which goes back to the sword that was at the entrance to the garden. We have gods who they're attributing to them the first resurrection of a human being, but not really a human being, a divine being. And so it's all confused. There's a confusion there. But Rashi does point out that they are drawing on these demonic powers in order to replicate the plagues, until it gets to the point where with the dust, they say this is the finger of God. We can't do this. None of our demonic powers are strong enough at this point. So we spent a lot of time on frogs Monday night. And so you could see how funny that was. I mean, this is a funny Torah portion. I mean, not in a good way for the Egyptians, but if you're the Hebrews, yes, you're groaning and crying out. But when Moses comes back and tells you that, yeah, Pharaoh goes to the bathroom just like you do every morning. In fact, that's where we had our conversation. He was sitting in the Nile, and I'm telling him he's not God, and bad things are going to happen. He's in a vulnerable place. And with the frogs, when you read the Hebrew text, you realize the frogs actually went inside the people. And that was our debate after class. Was it physical frogs that went inside the people, or was it demonic lying spirits, like it says in Revelation, that actually went inside the people? And what we're getting here is kind of a paleo understanding of demonic possession as we're reading about in the Gospels, because I don't think there's anything in the New Testament that we haven't already read about or was hinted to us in some way in the Tanakh itself, and more specifically in the Torah. I think there will be at least one seed of whatever we read anywhere else. There will be at least one seed in the Torah that's grown out of. And I think probably, other than we know the snake and that involvement all the way back in the garden, but in terms of using magic charms and calling on demonic powers and possession by demonic powers and lying spirits, then I think this is our source document for whatever we're reading as we get into the Brit Chadashah. So let me try to share the PowerPoints with you, and let me know if it drops my sound. Slideshow, play from current slide. Oh, you can't put that right over the front. I can't see it. Okay. Which this is later in the process, because we're scooting forward a little bit into the plague of the firstborn. Probably talk more about that next week. But in the process of applying these plagues, one of the plagues was a boil, plague of boils. And there were two plagues, the frog and the boil, where it's given the first time in the singular, like they were afflicted with a boil, and then it was boils. And then a frog came out of the river, and then it was frogs. What happened? Well, the Hebrew scholars are saying, yes, it came out as one entity, and then it basically, the strike, that supernatural strike of the hand of Adonai, then multiplies it many times. And the boil, if you'll remember from our lessons in Leviticus, there's several ways where, or several things that might precipitate an affliction of leprosy, which they believe that not just the Pharaoh that took Sarah was afflicted with leprosy, but also the Pharaoh that was called the king of Egypt, that he died, but then they kept calling him the king of Egypt. And they said, well, that had to have been the living death of leprosy, because it's like the children of Israel are groaning out louder. And so with that leprosy, it could originate in the hair around your mouth, which, remember, that usually had to do with gossip or evil speech. One of the places was in a boil. They would look where you had a boil, and if there was a white, kind of transparent hair growing out of that boil, it had to be examined for leprosy. And that boil, the shechin, it means to be very hot. And so you're going to see in Revelation repeatedly that scorching heat is being applied as part of the plagues of Revelation. And so these are related, at least thematically, to the plague of boils, which is when you see excessive anger. And there's another one that accompanies it, and it's a burn. If a hair grows out of an old burn, and again, if the hair is the wrong color, then it has to be examined by a priest, because it could be a strike of leprosy beginning to grow out of the burn. So there's two items there. There's a boil, which means something that's superheated hot. And if you've ever had a boil, I never have, but my husband has, and it's apparently extremely painful when those things get infected. And imagine if their bodies are covered with those things. It's bad enough if you have one, but if your body's covered in them, then you would be scorching hot all over your body. And then the burn, the leprosy can grow out of the burn. Both of these, if you take them together, you can say, well, he's intensifying whatever he's trying to tell us here about leprosy. If it can come out of a boil, which means something super hot, and a burn, which is something that is super hot, then it's usually equated with anger in scripture. When something is super hot, it's anger, excessive anger. And a lot of times excessive anger can lead to sin because it's an uncontrolled emotion. And so you see this even in Moses, how angry he's getting. Moses is talking to Pharaoh, and it says, thus says the Lord, about midnight, I am going out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones. All the firstborn of the cattle, let's see, as well. Moreover, there shall be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, such as there had not been before, and such as shall never be again. And that great cry, if you'll remember, is going to parallel that cry that's coming out from under the heavenly throne, where the saints are saying, how long, O Lord? They're crying out until you avenge our blood. And they're told to wait for a little while. He says, but against any of the sons of Israel, a dog will not even bark, whether against man or beast. And I think that's a metaphor in that context. Man or beast. We get the man and the beast in Revelation. There's people who have the mark of the beast. But we also have the man who's created on the same day as the beast. And the man, of course, would be that which is conformed to the image of Elohim, the one who is obedient. The beast would be the one who is disobedient. Because remember, the snake, the Nachash, it was the most cunning beast of the field. And we'll look at this here in a sec, but the beasts who were judged with the pestilence and with the hail were the beasts who remained in the field. I don't know if you've ever picked up on that technicality, but if they remained in the field, if they didn't come inside a house, or literally chased inside a house, then they fell under those two plagues. So he's saying, I'm going to make a distinction. But he says, whether against man or beast, that you may understand how the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. So what is he distinguishing? Egypt is going to be that metaphor of the beast, and Israel is going to be that metaphor of a man. But at the very same time, you have to look at them at the same thing, because the number of the beast is also the number of the man. They were created on the same day. So he's reteaching the lesson. I made you in my image. I did not make you in the image of the beast. The beast was created before you. The beast is the firstborn of the sixth day. But the prophecy is that the younger is the one who will have authority over the older. So the man who is younger in the creation was created to have authority over the beast who was created earlier in that day. And it's our job to conform ourselves to the image of Elohim, not to the image of the beast. Even though we have the same number, we're not the same. Count how many times on day 6 it will say that the beasts reproduce after their kind, but they're not our kind. And so he says, if you can't make a distinction, I will make a distinction. I will show you the difference between Egypt and Israel. If you don't know the difference between a beast of the field, a snake, trying to teach doctrine to you, and Elohim coming in the cool of the evening to teach doctrine to you, I will help you make a difference here. He says, all these your servants will come down to me and bow themselves before me, saying, go out, you and all the people who follow you, and after that, I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. So Moses is hot, but not in a bad way. I think at this point, he's reflecting or conforming to the image of Elohim in this exchange with Pharaoh. He's saying, okay, Pharaoh, I've given you lots of chances. Chances are up. And I'm going to show you for sure this time, because you think you're God. You say you've never heard of me. You put yourself as God at the table, at the seat, like you were seeing in those pictures of Egypt, how the Pharaoh seated himself in a place of prominence among the gods. Well, he's saying, all these your servants will come bow down to me. And they're going to tell you, let them go. Let the Hebrews go. I'm going to prove to you who God really is, and it's not you. And that's why I hesitated to pick that clip from Ancient Aliens, because they're taking a kind of a twisted viewpoint of what was actually going on. I think they're just as confused and babbling in a lot of cases, that they're not distinguishing between extraterrestrials and demonic influences, which the Torah portion tells us was common. And they say that's why at first Pharaoh and the people weren't that impressed with the miracles, with the plagues, because they say Moses and Aaron had come to a land of magic charms, signs and wonders. There was already sorcery in the land, and the people didn't know how to make a distinction. But after 10 plagues, they did. So we don't want to be the hard case that says, oh yeah, we got magicians can do that. No. We want to recognize the difference and test the apostles. And just because they bring us signs and wonders, if they don't speak according to the Torah, says Isaiah, then they have no dawn. They have no dawning of the Torah in them. That's how you can tell the difference. Okay, so we're going to back up a little bit to the wild beasts. Sometimes it'll say flies, but I would say probably most of the Jewish scholars are going to say it's actually wild beasts, a mixture of wild beasts, because the words are the same. Which I guess flies would follow wild beasts. That makes sense. But they say in this case, specifically, the wild beasts that were sent to Egypt were scorpions and serpents. Scorpions and serpents. Okay, that should sound familiar to you from Deuteronomy, the tzillah. And we couldn't figure out, is it a locust? Is it a hornet? Is it a scorpion? Is it a serpent? Is it a horse? Even John can't figure out exactly what it is, so he uses lots of different creatures to describe this supernatural bug. And their sting, he says, is like the sting of a scorpion. It's just you're not allowed to die. It's the whole point of it is torture and torment. Kind of echoes the words of the rich man in Sheol, where he says, I'm tormented in these flames. And if you think of two of those plagues specifically dealing with superheating the body, that makes sense. Revelation says, I looked and behold an ashen horse. And remember, ashen means a yellowish green. It's chloros in Greek. And if you saw one of those pharaohs on there, he's always painted green. That might be, if you had spare time to do a little research and figure out, in the clip, it'll name which pharaoh it was. See if there's more historical information about why he was always painted that green color, because green is a color of leprosy. It's Yerachon, I believe, in Hebrew, and that is a color of leprosy that's described in Leviticus. It says, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth. And right there, John is giving you the 4 altar judgments. You hear me talk about the 4 altar judgments? They're scattered through the prophets, but you'll also find them specifically in the Torah. Sometimes it'll be 1, sometimes it'll be 2, sometimes he'll threaten them with all 4. But they're called the 4 altar judgments. Famine, or ra'ev, it means to be hungry. Pestilence is dever, and that should sound familiar because word in Hebrew is devar. Like devarim, Deuteronomy, words. And it's a contronym. Dever is just pronounced differently than devar. Devar is the divine word. Dever is a pestilence when you depart from the word. So what determines whether something is a word of truth or a pestilence? It's your relationship to that word. If you're in obedience to that devar, then it's blessing, it's life, it's peace, it's all those wonderful things. But if you're in opposition to that devar of truth, then it will eventually break out on you in a dever, which is a pestilence. And often that pestilence is used in the context of falling on livestock, on animals. In other words, if this pestilence is falling on you, you're basically an animal. You're a beast. And then the other one is where it's not so much that you are a beast, it's that the wild beasts attack you. In this context, they're saying it's scorpions and serpents, but it could be lions, tigers, bears, hornets, any created creature that would turn on you and damage you or harm you. And then the sword, remember, cherev, a sword means to make thirsty. So sword, make thirsty, famine, make hungry, pestilence, be a beast, wild beast, be attacked by a beast. That's like the simple version of it. But any of these plagues that break out, any of the 10 or the 12, if we want to count the pre-plague and the plague within the plague, each of those will somehow hang on one of these 4. You can look at every one of those 10 and put them in one of these 4 categories if you know what they mean in Hebrew. Okay, and then Revelation 9:5, and then I'll skip down to 17 through 19, because we're talking here, remember, about the 4 altar judgments, and he says the wild beasts of the earth. And now he's talking about the supernatural bugs of Revelation 9, which we know is called the Tzirah in Deuteronomy 7. He says their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. And this is how I saw the vision, the horses and those who sat on them. The riders had breastplates, the color of fire, and of hyacinth and of brimstone. And the heads of the horses are like the heads of lions, and out of their mouths proceed fire and smoke and brimstone. There's more of the heat. A third of mankind was killed by these 3 plagues, by the fire, and by the smoke, and the brimstone, which proceeded out of their mouths. For the power of the horses is in their mouths and in their tails. For their tails are like serpents and have heads, and with them they do harm. So the torment is like the scorpion, and the power in their mouths are like serpents. So that fits very nicely with what the Jewish sages are saying about the plague of wild beasts on Egypt, as it was specifically the work of tormenting scorpions and the biting serpents. And these also went after the Israelites in the wilderness, by the way. When they would disobey in the wilderness, these same beasts would go after them. And remember, they had 5 months to do their work. They weren't supposed to kill you. They were just supposed to torment you. Okay, Now, Rashi's specific comment to Exodus 7:1, when Adonai says, I'm going to make you, it sometimes is translated God over Pharaoh with a small g. It's specifically Elohim in Hebrew. And Elohim can mean ruler, judge, God. But he's not telling Moses you're going to be God. He's telling him, I'm going to make you a ruler, a judge over Pharaoh in order for you to torture him, not kill him. You're not supposed to kill him yet. That comes later. First, I want you to torture him because he's going to have to be tortured in order to release my people. And so again, that fits very nicely with what John is prophesying here, that there will be a 5-month period of torture, specifically with high heat. And so we see that flying horse creature that's described in Revelation. It has these characteristics of the serpent and the scorpion, and it's described in Deuteronomy 7. And depending on your translation, when that word is used, it might say locust, it might say hornet, it might say something else, but it was a supernatural bug. It wasn't a normal sort of thing. And we could see that with John trying to describe it. He's like, okay, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's not like this, it's like this. It's because it's supernatural and it's really hard to get a handle, I'm sure, on what he's seeing. But it was a supernatural bug that had to go forth from the depths of Sheol by divine decree. Except in Deuteronomy 7, instead of being used like it is in this context to wreak havoc on the Egyptians and Pharaoh, in Deuteronomy 7, it's a different context. He's saying the people who remain in the land and resist you, when I take you back to Israel, he says, I will use that supernatural bug not to torment Egypt, but to torment your enemies in the land who are trying to intimidate you. And it uses in the context there of wild beasts. He says, I'm going to have to do it little by little, or the wild beasts would overcome you. So again, you've got the same context, but calling on these supernatural creatures to torment until the people are ready to get out of the land. In this case, until Pharaoh's ready to let the Hebrews get out of his land. The plague of pestilence we read about in Revelation 2:23. He says, I will kill her children with pestilence, and all the churches will know that I am he who searches the minds and the heart. So again, wild beasts, pestilence, we see those in Revelation, but we see them on a global scale. He's ramping it way up. And then let's look at the sign on the door. Revelation 16:18 through 21, it's going to give us more information about the plague of hail. It says there were flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder, and there was a great earthquake, such as there had not been since man came to be upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty, and huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of hail, because its plague was extremely severe. And if you remember, they did the same thing when they were struck with the boils in Revelation. They called them loathsome sores, and it was scorching them with heat. And it says, and they blasphemed and like chewed their tongues. It hurt so bad. It's like a living hell. And so that takes us back to the plague in Egypt, where you get the very same thing, and the hail is going to destroy the barley and the flax. And both of those have symbolic meaning. But this is the kind of the half plague, or the plague within the plague. They said were there 10 plagues or were there 12? Well, if leprosy had already fallen on Pharaoh's house that made him a dead man, that would have been like a pre-plague. And then with the plague of hail, not only did it destroy with these miraculous sizes, but the miracle was within the hail because there was fire within the ice and the ice did melt. So it was a miracle within a miracle, a plague within a plague. And again, it drives you back to what is the definition of heaven? Shemayim. What do you hear in Shemayim? You hear Aish for fire, you hear Mayim for water. And so in the heavenlies, you can walk through the water, you can walk through the fire and not be burned. But if you're evil, if you're wicked, the last thing you want to do is walk in the Shemayim because you will be flooded and burned. And that's the picture we get both in the plague of Egypt and in the plague in Revelation, because there's fire within ice, and it's not falling on the righteous, it's falling on the wicked, the people who are going to blaspheme. What's the difference? When we go through tribulation, it's not to turn us into blasphemers, but to turn us into repentant people and humble people and say, what do I need to change? That's why he does it. He says he's not slack concerning his promise, but he wants all to come to repentance. So when it finally gets to this point to where he's willing to torment and torture, he's saying, what does it take? Because if I can't bring you to repentance with 100-pound hailstones on fire and boils all over your body and frogs up your hind end, as Rashi says, yeah, that was a funny one. I could do a day's funny cartoon on that one, but no, I probably couldn't send it. So blame the frog, right? But if I can't get your attention with all these things, then really you're telling me this is what you want. You prefer wickedness to me. Hey, that's what he's testing here. But with this particular plague, even though I'm showing you the Revelation version, same plague from the Torah portion. The creatures, the domestic livestock, if they were in the field, they were destroyed. Any people that were in the field were destroyed. What had to happen? They had to come inside the house. They had to come inside a shelter to survive this particular plague. And the same thing applied to the pestilence. When the pestilence, it was specifically on the livestock. But if they would gather the livestock into a house or a shelter, the pestilence wouldn't come on them. And you can see here a hint, a sign, a pre-sign, definitely to the Hebrews, that in the not too distant future, I'm going to gather you into a house. And that's where your salvation will be. But even before that happens, I'm going to give you an example on the beasts. I'll show you how it works on an animal first. So even if the Egyptians believed and brought their livestock into a house or a shelter, those two plagues did not destroy them. And they said that's how Pharaoh's 600 choice chariot horses survived, that his servants had enough common sense. And you can see later when they're telling Pharaoh, don't you know Egypt is destroyed? They got the message long before he did, but he was having his heart hardened by the end. But there were enough among his own servants who brought that livestock into barns or stables or whatever they were using to protect the animals. And so, there's just kind of a hint. There will come a time you're going to have to take a lamb, you're going to have to put blood on the doorpost, and you're going to have to be gathered into a house in order to be saved and protected from the pestilence of the firstborn. Because remember back here in Revelation 2:23, it's killing the children a pestilence. And a pestilence usually applies to a wild beast. What does that tell us? The children of the beast will fall under the pestilence. Whereas the children of the virtuous woman who keep the testimony of Yeshua, the commandments of God, they will be saved from the flood. They will be saved. This is the opposite. Okay, and if we look at the karpas of a Passover Seder, remember the judgment was on the flax and the barley, which was in the ear, but it wasn't set on the stalk yet. It was Aviv, but it wasn't ready for harvest. So it's giving you a GPS for time of year. It's coming up in the spring. It's very close to Passover time. And we know that because of the progression of the plagues as well. But on a Seder plate, you'll usually have a green, some sort of green, karpas, like parsley. You could use cilantro or whatever, something nice and green, because it represents, again, the hyssop that they would have taken to put the blood on the doorpost. And again, remember the positioning of the priest's burial benches, how it formed the letter chet for life, chai. Well, the same thing with the doorpost. If you put that blood on the doorpost, what letter are you outlining on your door? Chet, life. There's going to be life inside of here. And which you use the green color for Passover because it reminds you, it's not like the Muslim Ramadan that just rotates through the months because it's not fixed by season. It's only fixed by the moon. But in the Hebrew reckoning, yes, you reckon your months by the moon, but the feast cannot migrate into a different season. So in that aspect, you reconcile the Earth's movement around the sun with the moon's movement around the Earth. You can take these two opposites and reconcile them so that Passover is fixed in the spring, so that it will always occur around the time of the Aviv of the barley, which in this case, we're in Egypt. We're not in Israel, but you get the same sign that there's an impending Passover because this barley is almost set when it's destroyed. And the flax, oh, there it is. I probably should have advanced the slide. The barley, its destruction, remember that's poor man's bread. And one thing, it was not in that clip, but I found it in a different spot on the Pharaohs, like economically what was being judged was my question. Because if you want to destroy a nation, you have to destroy its economic system, not just its military. And Rashi actually makes a point that the progression of these plagues is like a military siege. And he takes each plague and breaks it down as to how this matches an ancient siege of a city. But barley was so important to the Egyptians because just as much as, what else did they use? Not just money for payment. They actually paid their workers pretty well. From the records and the things that they found, they had pretty good health care for that era. They took pretty good of their builders, pretty good care of their builders. But they could also be paid in beer. They were big beer drinkers in Egypt. And what do you make beer out of? Barley. So you've got one of the primary, he's judged the Nile and the fish in the Nile and the marketplace of the Nile, because remember, it's going to be like an interstate highway where you take goods up and down. He judges that part of their economic system by turning the Nile to blood for 7 days. And then he destroys the barley, which is another staple for the Egyptians because they drink so much beer. So it's not just the bread that's judged, it's the drink. So they're not just being made hungry with famine, ra'ev, they're being made thirsty with a sword. He's using at the same time famine and sword by destroying the barley because he destroyed their food and their drink. And when you think that his workers could be paid in beer, he's also destroying their money. So again, he's working with altar judgments. And what was the point I wanted to make with that? Oh, with the barley and the flax, did I do a PowerPoint for it? Maybe not. Remember the Pishon River of Eden, the outer river? The rabbis equated that in the natural realm with the Nile River because of the pishton, the flax that grew on its banks. And Egyptian linen was famous for its quality, highly sought after, but it was very sexual because it was like flimsy see-through. It was designed to be a garment you could see through. It wasn't the garment of modesty like the priests wore, but it was really a garment of immodesty when the Egyptians manufactured it. So by judging the flax, which was set in its stock, what is he doing? He's destroying another part of their economic system and their immodesty, that symbol of Egyptian linen. And so, like I said, we keep getting these contrasts between that which is heavenly and spiritual and that which is earthly and corrupted. And so he's judging this corruption of the lower river, of the, not the Pishon of the lower garden, but the Pishton on the Nile of the physical earth. It really starts making you think higher when you see the destruction of the lower. In Exodus 9:20, the text says that the Egyptians who did fear Adonai actually chased their servants and their choice livestock from the fields and gathered them into houses to protect them from the pestilence and the hail. And if you go back to the Haftorah portion, that's what's told, that Pharaoh will not be gathered from the field. He will be one of those beasts that is struck with the hailstones and the pestilence. So again, the Haftorah is helping explain the Torah portion, which is helping explain when you see those things in Revelation. But the livestock who were chased and gathered into houses were saved, similar to how the Hebrews were saved when they gathered behind the doorposts of their house. If you're left in the field, remember the snake, the beast of the field, then you're killed. You've got the locusts that cover the surface of the land. And again, this is just another aspect of the tzila, the supernatural bug. Some translations will call him a locust. But again, he has all these different aspects, like a scorpion, like a serpent. And it's significantly, it says, they will eat every tree which sprouts for you out of the field. A tree in scripture is a metaphor of a human being. And it even differentiates between fruit trees and not fruit trees. You can't cut down a fruit tree. Because it's going to be food for you. And it says, is the tree of the field a man that you should chop him down? And it's trying to make you think about trees in terms of representing human beings. And so the locust, it says it's going to eat every tree which sprouts for you out of the field. Remember, the field is the place where the judgment is taking place. The snake was the most cunning beast of the field. That was his domain. He wasn't happy with the domain of the fields. He wanted the domain of the garden. He wanted to usurp the authority of the garden. He says, okay, if you got trees out there sprouting in the field with the snake, the locusts are going to eat them. And remember also in Revelation, they're told, don't harm the green trees, the green grass. Why? Because the green grass or the green tree is the human being that's still got moisture. Like it says in the Song of Moses, like dew on thirsty grass. that the word of God is still falling on a soft heart and a receptive heart. And that is the green tree that you don't chop down. That's the green tree that you don't harm. But for the tree of the field, which is a war tree that you can chop down to lay siege to a city. Now do you see that parallel in that part of the Torah? It's like this strange, you can chop down this kind of tree if you're going to lay siege against a city. That's exactly what he's doing in this Torah portion. He's sending the locust to chop down the trees that are being used to lay siege to Egypt. So he gives us layer after layer after layer of symbols to help us understand what's happening. I said there'd never been so many locusts, nor would there ever be so many again, for they covered the whole surface of the land so that the land was darkened. And they ate every plant of the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. Thus nothing green was left on tree or plant of the field through all the land of Egypt. So the judgment is still out in the field when you should be in the house when this is happening, not in the field with the snake. Revelation 9:3 says, then out of the smoke came locusts upon the earth, and power was given to them as the scorpions of the earth have power. They were told not to hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. So it's reaffirming what you've read in the Torah portion. They were not permitted to kill anyone, but to torment for 5 months. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. And that's what Moses' job was, to call down plagues that would torment Pharaoh, either into repentance or into total destruction. That might wrap up where I wanted to go. This might be old stuff. The sign on the forehead. Oh, related to that, because remember, they couldn't hurt the trees who had the seal of God on their foreheads. How will you know you have the seal of God on your forehead? Passover. If you're observing the Passover, if you gathered inside of the house, even if somebody had to chase you in there, you want to invite people into Yeshua, but every now and then you kind of have to okay, if I have to chase you to get you in this house when the time comes, I'll do what I got to do to get you inside this house. It says for 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. And on the 7th day there should be a feast unto the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten throughout the 7 days. And remember, the plague on the Nile, the blood, was 7 days. So you had, again, a prequel to help you understand this. And why it's not just the Passover day we observe, but then we observe 7 days of unleavened bread. And I think this is where the vile lie, I think it's in the protocols of the elders of Zion and lots of Islamic literature, that this lie that Jews will take the blood of Christians and Muslims and put it in their matzah dough and eat it at Passover. Again, it's corruption of truth. It's babble. It's confusion, except it's a frog. It's a frog lie. It's a frog croaking. But people believe it because they want to. But here's the truth. It says, unleavened shall be eaten throughout the 7 days, and nothing leavened shall be seen among you, nor shall any leaven be seen among you in all your borders. You shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. So if you've had this personal salvation experience with Yeshua, you're gathering at the Passover, you're telling your children the Passover story, then what are you doing? It says that these commandments were to be put on the Israelites' hand and forehead as a sign of what was in the heart. Well, it also says that keeping the Passover is accomplishing the same thing. It's going to be a sign on your forehead and a sign on your hand. And you guys have seen me do the teaching of the tefillin before with the 4 vav sheen versus the 3 vav sheen, the spirit versus the letter being the beast part of the human being, but the spirit being that image of Elohim taking authority over the beast. Let's see. I think all the rest of this is just like scattered in there. Things that got left over. Yeah, because I recycled some PowerPoints. Okay, so let me stop the recording.